My name is Malcolm Fleming, the Deputy Chair of the New Zealand Construction Industry Council. The NZCIC is the peak body of the New Zealand construction industry, whose membership is comprised of 35 construction associations. For the 2020 election, we took the opportunity to develop this list of 6 election platforms that represented the key opportunities and threats that were facing the New Zealand construction industry. We sent the NZCIC election platforms to the building and construction spokesperson for each of the 5 main political parties and invited them to participate in a recorded interview with Radio New Zealand journalist Phil Pennington. Those conversations included each politician being provided with 2 minutes to articulate their party's overarching building and construction policy, following which Phil asked them questions pertaining to the NZCIC election platforms. The result is 5 separate videos, 1 per political party. As the editing is light, the recordings come across as a conversation, with Phil's follow-up questions changing to follow the thread of the politician's answer to Phil's main election platform question. Whether you watch the full series of 5 or only watch those of parties that you're more aligned with, we hope you find that the material informative. The NZCIC would like to acknowledge the assistance of Radio New Zealand in creating this series.
Greetings, folks. The most important thing in respect of the construction accord and the actual construction industry from the New Zealand First perspective is actually decluttering the regulatory framework. For the last 3 years, I've watched with growing discontent our inability to have pared back the regulatory framework and to ensure that local government focus their efforts and costs on those areas where there's genuine risk. So number 1, I no longer, and our party is no longer confident that the current regulatory framework reflected through the Building Act is fit for purpose in relation to the post-COVID experience. We hoped that we'd be able to declutter it in the way David Parker improved the Resource Management Act through the accelerated fast-track process. Sadly, we were disappointed in that regard. Secondly, there's a grave danger in front of us once the Trans-Tasman travel emerges that we'll lose, as we did in the 90s, a lot of talent to Australia. I speak from personal experience because a lot of my whānau come from this industry and they've never returned from Australia. So that, in that way, as the infrastructure minister and the building and construction spokesperson for the purposes of this interview, the pipeline of certainty has to be absolutely supported, and we will not get certainty unless we've got a better regulatory framework that gets consents out in a more efficient manner. And I know master builders agree with me. The third thing that I'd say is that the difficulty with providing more construction activity is not purely a construction problem. It is a problem of access to land and the way in which local government under the Resource Management Act are seemingly incapable of bringing fresh resource in the form of buildable land to market. We did back Mr. Twyford in relation to an urban authority that would allow developers to aggregate land and to declutter the process. So to sum up, Phil, an attack on red tape, a greater level of certainty around the pipeline, which is related to regulatory liberalisation. And the third thing that I'd say is don't disconnect the Building Act from the other statutory mechanisms, including the RMA, which we want to see reformed, and dare I say it, the Public Works Act.
So the construction industry accord, what's New Zealand's first position on the problem we have and what the accord was set up to address of too much risk transfer going on in government procurement? Many huge contracts, the government is very dominant in that sector, and there's been a transfer of risk onto contractors and onto the industry. What is your party's position on trying to mitigate that?
Sadly, I never got the role of being in charge of procurement. Had I been in the position of control in that regard, I would most certainly have streamlined and shared the risk in such a way that we avoid the transmission gully imbroglio. Now, I know that's civil construction, but the lesson there is going to be applicable to vertical construction and built construction as well. We recently, or last 18 months, established the Infrastructure Commission, which I was in a privileged position to lead. And one of the key pieces of work that we've asked them to do is recalibrate the risk sharing model. I think it's wrong. We've been lobbied as a party on numerous occasions to recalibrate it. And I think in the post-COVID environment, given that we're already using the Crown balance sheet to expedite economic activity and to reward people for their own investment and their own efforts, that I basically am saying I agree with what we've been trying to do with that, with your constituency. The sad thing is we've done very little in actual fact in relation to recalibrating risk over the last 2 or 3 years. And sadly, I was not the minister. Had that have been the case, I would have shaken the tree and would be getting the fruits of a far fairer system.
I take it with the Accord, you call itself your party supports and backs the Accord. Is there any parts of that that you would change?
We're great believers in the Accord. I've been to numerous meetings. Obviously, I know a lot of the key figures from our construction sector. I'd say one thing I'm always a doubting Thomas about is that I like to see these instruments, whether they're bureaucratic compacts or political accords, they've got to grow feet and legs and hands. And we need practical demonstration on a weekly basis. And I think with the pipeline of work coming out of the $3 billion of shovel, the rough end of $3 billion of shovel-ready mahi, there's a good opportunity to ensure that we practice what we preach.
Would you support putting more money into getting NZS 3910, the basic contract, where it's trying to be reframed, and the funding on that is largely falling on the industry to reframe that and get that really cemented in? Would you support the government coming more on board with that? For instance, could the building levy be broadened to fund that reframing of the basic contract 3910?
Well, as you know, the building levy fund was slightly in a surplus, if I'm not mistaken, over the last couple of years. But look, I think if I can put it to you this way in your members, Phil, what we need to use as a basis for driving forward is the need to generate revenue, the need to ensure that post-COVID we keep solvency strong. And one way of doing that is ensuring that the Crown plays the most effective role it can, the most positive role it can, and shed the old ways of thinking.
Does that mean getting 3910 better, faster?
Yeah, it does. I've already said to you, I believe there should be a simpler, fairer process with less complications in contract development, as we've seen in the imbroglio around Transmission Gully. And if the Crown has to use resources to create a fairer and simpler approach, then that's a given, provided it actually strips red tape.
Would priority be making sure that the retention system is watertight to protect subbies?
Yeah, look, I go back to the days when Mainzeal crashed. I was a Labour politician back there. I've got lots of whānau who have suffered when this retention system doesn't perform. So our party, I've discussed this with Ron Mark, who's also our local government spokesman, we're thoroughly behind a robust and more defensible system that causes the moms and pops who own the trade firms to have absolute certainty they'll get putea when disaster strikes.
Moving on to the second, building regulation. Is your party, would they support mandatory third-party certification of building products and assurance? So there's mandatory third-party certification so that the industry can be sure of the products they're dealing with.
Well, you probably already know the answer to this. We're very leery about a lot of the products that are coming in from overseas, in the sense that can we put hand on heart that, and I need talk no further than steel. So can we put hand on heart? So I think you already know the answer to that. New Zealand First is profoundly supportive of that, with the proviso that don't use it, Phil, as an opportunity to gouge or to increase monopolistic behaviour. International trade is important if it provides us with a diverse range of products, but those products have to be as robust and have to be as durable as what you and I would trust if it's made here in New Zealand.
Is your party's policy to encourage modern methods of construction? We're talking about prefabricated type houses being built in China, but also locally with factories. Would you encourage that, and how would you control that?
Well, let's start with how you encourage it. You only encourage it by giving people a receivable. If you're going to invest millions of dollars in a factory out the back of West Auckland somewhere, or to bring in prefab material, then people need the certainty that there's a market to buy it. The largest market purchaser, I would say to you, in a lot of this construction outcomes you're talking about will be the Crown, maybe a little bit local government. So the first thing is I would imagine any investor is looking to ensure that they have a receivable, they have a guaranteed purchaser.
Does that mean that you would encourage Kāinga Ora to basically buy prefabricated houses?
Yeah, if we want speed and we want volume, then we've got to change our ways. It's not the only answer, mate. It's not the only answer, but we need to ensure that if we're bringing in more of this product, either from Vietnam or China, then going back to the answer I just gave you, we can stand hand on heart that it's durable and the process that it's been through will stand up to the New Zealand conditions, whether or not it's floods, changing climate, or earthquakes.
Looking at people, capacity, capabilities, what's your basic policies around equipping the industry and apprenticeships?
Well, I think people, if they're of a fair-minded disposition, would know that New Zealand First, when we came in 2017, and in particular me through the Provincial Growth Fund, we have poured a hell of a lot of money into apprenticeships. I personally believe Apprenticeships Day has well and truly come, and the narrative that success is measured by a course, an advanced course at university, I think those days are coming to an end, and we need to redeem and restore the respect and the value of apprenticeships. For those reasons, not only have we put a whole lot of dough into genuine apprenticeships, but we put a lot of dough into getting people on the escalator with foundation courses on the job and actually then turning into apprenticeships.
There's been a lot of change in the field of politics and of training, that framework which is being pulled apart and overhauled. Do you support it as it's being changed? Would you change it again, or are you going to keep it as it is?
Well, that bottle's been uncorked, folks. And I don't think anyone can credibly argue that the Polytech model that we've watched over the last 9, 12, 15, 20 years is sustainable. So we're not resiling from the changes that we've made there, but those changes must be driven not only by efficient delivery, but linked to what does the market actually need? What does the actual market want? And I think that's been a classic failing of a lot of the polytechs. They've ended up chasing bums on seats. They've ended up chasing international students. We ourselves have relied excessively on migrant labour because of the unwillingness either of the public sector and the private sector to train our own people. I think COVID has shown that those days are over.
What's New Zealand's policy on trying to smooth out the boom-bust cycle? You know, in bust, everyone goes to Australia, boom, they're all back here. Do you think that, for instance, the workforce development councils, are they going to be adequate to map the demand and to smooth it out? Do you have other ideas in that field?
Well, it will not come as a surprise to you to know that we've always been doubting Thomases in relation to this unfettered reliance on migrant labour. But I live in the real world as well, Phil. I know that there are specialist practitioners, there's talent that the firms need to bring in from overseas, and I'd like to see a bespoke process at the border where people represent the skills that we want, not giving people what they want. And I think until the industry and the health department and a future government come up with a bespoke solution, that's going to be a major bottleneck insofar as very rare skills. Secondly, I'm the guy who championed and with Grant Robertson led out the $3 billion shovel-ready projects. Why did we do that? We took the advice of Mark Binns, amongst other things, when he warned us that vertical construction needed more projects, it needed less red tape, and we needed to move with alacrity. Going forward, there'll be a challenge as to what extent should the Crown continue to incentivise or underwrite that type of activity. But I'd remind everyone, there's a power of dough that's already been committed. 12 billion was committed last February. Kāinga Ora has the ability to raise its own pūtea, and there's $3 billion worth of shovel-ready projects that have yet to be fully rolled out in any manner or form, and there are $3 billion of provincial growth fund projects, not exclusively construction, but much of it is infrastructure and construction. So I think people should be fair-minded and say that my track record on behalf of New Zealand First is solid in terms of overcoming the boom-bust, and we've built a pipeline of investment and a pipeline of certainty subject to the red tape being stripped away and these projects coming to market in a timely fashion.
We're talking a lot about shovel-ready, but what about design-ready for architects, consultants? They haven't got the same certainty. And with the shovel-ready stuff, there's not certainty around vertical. There's much more talk about horizontal. So what are you going to do to make sure that these people who, for instance, architects, engineers, consultants, who are also trying to plan ahead, they have projects perhaps on the go now, but they are in and they don't know what's going to come. Also, your vertical builders are in something in the same situation. What are you going to do about that?
The Crown can fund in the future a certain percentage of the activity, economically speaking, you're talking about. The private sector at the moment is hampered. New Zealand First wants to see a handsome depreciation regime introduced sooner rather than later to incentivise investors themselves to put money on the line and to bring projects forward. As I've said, it is important that the Crown continue to incentivise, and that's what I want to do, and that's what we, if we're privileged enough to form another government, will be pushing for. But I've got to warn everyone, the Crown, whilst it's a big player, the private sector needs to fire as well, and it will fire, in my belief, if there's a greater sense of return through a depreciation schedule that's handsome, if there's a market where there's purchases, and if there is a genuine attempt in a post-COVID environment to reformat the regulatory environment so that we can actually move forward and grow, invest, and deliver.
Will you support the government to put money immediately into local bodies so that they can get their contracts restarted, so into councils?
Well, I think the answer there is already yes, because we are doing it through the three waters. Now, whilst that's not purely vertical construction, it is construction. But there's a big outstanding question going forward. How do we get local government to be more efficient? I can give you horror stories about how local government has become so risk averse in issuing building permits and resource consents. I know of many firms that have actually just given up and have gone on to do other things. So before any money is given to local government, they've got to demonstrate that their operations are efficient and they're fit for purpose in a post-COVID environment. All we're going to do is pour money into entities who will have a culture that is incompatible with growing revenue and growing the economy. Only three ways we're going to get out of this challenge for a construction sector as a small part of a broader economy. Number one, we're either going to put up taxes. Number two, we're either going to cut services. Or number three, we're going to grow the economy. New Zealand First is firmly in the sphere of growing the economy. You won't grow the economy unless you change the model of growth that is not cluttered by unnecessary levels of red tape. And I know the master builders and a host of your other participants are solidly on board with that.
In terms of law changes, how do you want to use the law to get away from the cheapest price model that we've got?
I think we need to be fair that that's a culture that dominated a lot of the Crown activity, which is why Transmission Gully, I suspect, is in such an imbroglio. And the review that's been announced into Transmission Gully will reveal some incredibly valuable insights into that regard. But at the end of the day, if you're a minister, New Zealand First wants to be very responsible in relation to the taxpayer's purse, we've got to ensure that the balance is fair, that the taxpayers don't end up blaming the politicians for being fleeced, and firms don't go broke because of the inflexibility. So the best way to construct law, mate, is to look out, don't look in, and look out for models that already work, look out to the stakeholders in the industry and strike a balance. And I think everything I've said to you to date, I'm not a believer in just promising you can pass a law and solve problems of culture, solve problems of institutional performance. You need to change culture as well as law.
Is there any one thing that you would be telling the ministries around procurement in order to improve that, to get away from the low ball model that we've got? For instance, could you bring in something that said, good range of tenders, the bottom tender, never take the bottom tender? Why not do that?
Yeah, well, there's several options. You can either say don't be lowballed, which is once again, I don't care if you're getting hoo-ha with me, Phil, talking about transmission gully. That's going to be a poster child, and a lot of lessons are going to come to bear there, mate. Come to the fore there. The other thing too is have a focus on the full value and in terms of the durability of the project. But just step back for a moment. The best model is a model that a politician drives in association with the investors, the builders, the insurers. And I think we can get a good model, but you'll never get it unless there's a clear political direction that changes the culture of the people day to day who manage the procurement processes, who themselves aren't joined up. And that's just a reflection of the silofied approach that we've had to tolerate in government. And I think in areas where I personally have been involved on behalf of New Zealand First, we've whipped the bureaucracy, quite frankly, much better into shape.
Do you have any policies in particular around designing for climate change or making more sustainable buildings? I think with COVID, more stress has gone on resilience, so we're in danger of losing sight of the sustainability goals. So what about New Zealand First policy around climate change in the construction industry that can cope with that?
All policies in the future that New Zealand First champions in respect of where climate change regulation meets day-to-day economic activity will be driven by science and not ideology. That's number one. Number two, it's important that we not lose sight of the need to generate and expand our revenue base in the post-COVID environment. So the approach that I have taken as a minister, and I'll continue to take forward, is adaptation is as important as mitigation. To the extent that we can grow sustainability by becoming more adaptable to meet the changing needs and demands of Mother Nature, then that's a given. But these changes should be driven by what the industry thinks is deliverable, not just windowless rooms where scientists, academics, and bureaucrats can see the future that is not practical. So I'm very much a doubting Thomas about any policy or any changes that are not rooted in the practical reality of delivery. That has made me sound slightly Tyrannosaurus Rex in terms of climate change. But I want everyone to bear in mind on this program, yes, we need to be adaptable. Yes, we need to respect the fact that the climate is definitely changing, but we also have to operate within an envelope over a period of time that we can deliver on. No pipe dreams, mate.